So, this business today is Dr. Vernon Johns. When I attended Howard University School of Divinity, I learned very early that there are 5 classic marks of the church. There is kerygma, spelled Keyrygma. This means proclamation of the gospel, proclaiming, announcing, preaching. Then there is Didache, spelled Didache, training in the way of Christ, teaching. It begins when we enter the life of the church and is a lifelong enterprise. Koinonia, Koinonia, which is basically community in Christ. It translates into words like community, fellowship, and participation. There is also diaconia, spelled Diakonia, which is serving Christ. Diaconia in the world of the New Testament is referred to the role of a servant. Diaconia is informed by the parable of the sheep and the goats, in which Jesus teaches that he is present in the most of strangers that we meet. Finally, there is liturgia, Liturgia, which is the worship of God. Literally means a work of the people. As a black preacher, steeped in the context of formal seminary education, Dr. Vernon Johns juxtaposed kerygma with diaconia. So, to celebrate John's contribution to diaconic preaching, I have written this story, but I think it is more than that. It is also dedicated to my homiletics professor at Howard University School of Divinity, Dr. Evans Crawford. Dr. Evans always admonished us. As students, he would say, your sermon must have a hum. I learned about that hum, strangely enough, from a white man. His name was Tom Neese. It is Tom's commitment to Wesleyan compassion that enabled me to connect kerygma and diaconia. Incidentally, Tom, as we would say in the seminary, couldn't preach a lick. Turn away. Tom may not have excelled in homiletics, rhetoric, or sermon construction. Tom might not have been able to face the Areopagus like Paul did in Acts. But Tom taught me that preaching that does not connect with those you serve becomes the sound of Trinidad's Juve Jump Up, or ex-President George W. Bush with a blowhorn. I can hear you. Hopefully, through this video and through your preaching, you would stop preaching and start to communicate. In his perennial militancy in speech, action, and from his pen, from racial equality for all men, Reverend Johns rocked the Montgomery community with far-reaching consequences elsewhere in this great land of ours. Through his teachings and his precepts, he aroused not only the Dexter family, but hundreds of citizens of Montgomery to the changes that had taken place and to those which were still taking place in the relationships of mankind, and emphasized the concept of human fellowship that would know no narrow racial, religious, or national boundaries. Dr. Vernon Johns kindled a strong flame of thoughts of the importance that every individual should have in the affairs of the world. And this importance would have implications for every phase of human existence: the political, the industrial, and the intellectual. But most important of all, it would establish a new basis for the way in which the peoples of the world will deal with each other. A blaze of self-esteem was kindled in the community by Dr. Johns, but awaited the necessary fuel to start the conflagration. Bleary-eyed, I stumbled out of Oxford's Bodleian Library and into the school's divinity's limestone vaulted halls. I paused to adjust my glasses and rub my eyes and wish I had brought from home a bad headache even. Scott is already there waiting for me, and I can tell he's got things to say. Isn't the way his beard looks even more unkempt than usual, and the way he's pacing in tight circles? He's the only person I know who can give the impression of pacing while still sitting slouched in his chair in my office during tutorials. We had met in the homiletics class I'm teaching as a visiting professor, and while he was well versed in Du Bois and Washington, his knowledge of homiletics had a gap as wide as the barrel chest of Vernon Johns, the most misunderstood preacher of the American civil rights movement. Like an Abraham or a Alabama hound dog, he'd taken the scent and disappeared for a day or two. I'm intrigued. What perspective would a white man from Oxford have on a black man from Montgomery? He was a paradox, professor, a walking, talking, preaching paradox. W.B. Yeats wrote, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold," in his poem The Second Coming, as he created a nightmarish vision of the end of times. But there is, perhaps, a wider truth to the imagery which extends beyond the book of Revelation. Nigerian author Chinua Achebe titled his 1958 book Things Fall Apart almost certainly to invoke Yeats's imagery as he tells the story of the arrival of white colonial nations and the following collapse of Igbo tribal society. Achebe gives voice to a widely held feeling that the cultural centers of African life cannot hold their shape against the penetration of whites. A century after Okonkwo lost his village and a decade after Achebe published his book, the civil rights movement in America comes ostensibly to an end. And yet, against all the centrifugal forces acting against it, blacks in America find themselves in a status quo, swinging ponderously between the divergent policies of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. If the story of North and South were expanded to include the metaphorical compass points of East and West, here you would find Du Bois and Washington. In the East, we might see Du Bois' advocacy for a white education for blacks as a route out of oppression. And in the West, we can look to Washington's black compromise with whites. One might conclude that America's adoption of these two paths has left the civil rights movement stalled at best and failing at worst. Between these two compass points of East and West was Vernon Johns, somehow paradoxically occupying the undefined space between two poles, the marginalized preacher from Montgomery. Vernon was himself a paradox in many ways. He's wanted people to be less provincial, but he himself was provincial in his accent and mannerisms. He wanted freedom and integration, but he tried to achieve this through a segregationist farming cooperative. He was deeply, polemically, bordering on violently engaged in the political world of his time. But he was a poor strategist and apparently utterly unaware of how to save or to use mass media. Western philosophy has learned through Aristotle's work in logic to be leery of paradox. Christianity, on the other hand, revels in paradoxical mysteries. Perhaps, then, the answer to progressive preaching and progressive social policies is not to be simply rhetorical or simply political. Perhaps Vernon Johns shows us that hard as he is to grasp in his atypical and superficially inconsistency, is that a balancing act of schools of thought is the most effective approach. The two figures the civil rights movement holds more dear than Johns sit very firmly in clearly defined and easy to understand corners. Du Bois, in the East of our metaphor, is an advocate of didache. A fine position, but a singular and specific and maybe naive position. Washington, in the West of our metaphor, leans on koinonia for his policies of compromise. And again, koinonia is a vital position to hold, but a potentially class-ridden and elitist position. Because between these flawed binaries, we find Vernon Johns, the preacher who fuses charisma with diaconia in a sophisticated form of homiletics we would do well to pay more attention to. Johns was a dangerous antagonist in the civil rights movement, far from the apologist to the East and the West. He spoke dangerous words directly to whites, laying down the gauntlet of responsibility at their feet. As Rufus Barrow points out, he was one of God's bad boys and is rightly considered a true prophet in the tradition of Christian prophets. He's a prophet who has gone unheard far too long, and our continued ignorance of him and his perfect blend of charisma and diaconia carries the same fate for us as for Troy in their rejection of Cassandra. While the South broiled in the heat of righteous discontent, far away in the cold white North, Marshall McLuhan wrote about how the medium is the message. McLuhan's idea was pure thought and transcended race relations, and yet was deeply important to understanding the charismatic preaching of Vernon Johns. The medium for McLuhan was everything about communication that was not the language. If you strip away words, strip away symbols, strip away icons, strip away body language and skin color, you're left with a medium. Sometimes that medium is a simple light bulb. McLuhan wrote, an opening of a space in the darkness that wasn't open before, but enabling that space to carry meaning belonging to another ontology. In the same way, he argued, all communication has a medium, and that medium shapes the message. This apparently benign piece of meta communication is critically important in understanding both why Vernon Johns has been marginalized, even discriminated against, and why his own kind of charismatic preaching was so important to the civil rights movement and remains so today. North America belongs, for the most part, to Protestant cultures and traditions, or at least it certainly did so in the 1950s and 60s. South America belongs most completely then and now to the Catholic tradition. Holding these divergent religious denominations together along our now familiar path or story of North and South is the life of Jesus Christ and his love and respect for those downtrodden by poverty. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written in 1968 by Paulo Freire, sets out a roadmap for how didache and diaconia must be side by side to enable those oppressed by poverty and politics to liberate themselves. Freire shows us that the classic model of an education achieved from an institution where the pupil arrives innocent and empty and is benevolently filled to the brim by the gatekeepers of knowledge is as class-ridden as it sounds. Freire argues for a diakonic system of education which is completely compatible with Black liberation theology. Indeed, one can argue that Black liberation theology only works if you adopt Freire's proposed model of an education where education is deeply embedded, even springs from the community in which people live. Just as McLuhan points out the underlying medium shapes the message, Freire and liberation theology make the point that the underlying community shapes education. Vernon Johns was so dangerous to both blacks and whites precisely because his position, rooted so deep in diaconia, sent the clear message that the capitalist class structure of Western economies was the enemy of liberation. Whites hated this message because it showed them the cracks of corruption in their beloved ivory towers in New England. Blacks might have disliked the idea that liberation from oppression did not guarantee being lifted from poverty. John's message required more patience and the rejection of the white class system. And the poor people of any race do often love and admire and covet the wealth of the classes above them. Let me just say this. We are all shaped into the adults we become in the crucibles of our childhoods, embedded as they are in the virtues of sins of our forebears. So perhaps it's no surprise that Vernon Johns was forged to love justice. His grandparents and parents were fiery and passionate and, sometimes murderers, but they fueled always by their passion for racial justice. In this way, Vernon Johns embodies the Judaic concepts of mercy and love and justice, which has often brought Jesus to anger. Throughout his life, Johns was inclined to turn over the tables of the moneylenders, or rather, to sell his farm produce in white areas, taunting and baiting whites to ask him why he does this, precisely so he can ask them why he should not. In his preaching, Johns refused to remind us of our original sin and present himself as a virtuous conqueror holding the moral high ground of our souls. Rather, he spoke like his congregation, leaving everyone slightly confused at the juxtaposition of this and his intellectual eyewear. Confused at the utter lack of pretension, but nonetheless knowing that when he took on his charismatic role, his words came from a humble place. Rather than hold himself spiritually apart, he formed a cooperative and got his hands dirty with his congregation in the field, so that he was deeply embedded in diaconia, a mutual co-diaconia with his flock. Johns precisely exemplified the paradoxical balance between the kerygma of intellectual proclamation and the diaconia of community roots. From this nexus of kerygma and diaconia, Johns was able to preach a new message and lift the oppressed in a new way. A diaconia-infected kerygma was John's own medium, and within this space, he generated a powerful message of love and compassion and racial justice. Similarly, a preacher steeped in the diaconia of his people, he was able to enact a theology of liberation that is as humble as it is effective. Ladies and gentlemen, Johns preached dangerous and bold proclamations, which did something nearly unique in the binary worlds of Du Bois and Washington. He spoke the words his community was speaking, giving voice to the oppressed. It is safe to kill Negroes in Montgomery. And when the rapist is white. Looking back on those sermon titles from today, we can see how prophetic his words were. The compromises have not worked. And white education has been the answer for only a few. And looking back, we wonder if Johns had been taken seriously, had not spent 60 years being marginalized by blacks and whites, could the civil rights movement have been more successful than it was? And standing where we are today, it is increasingly clear to see that it is only through John's blend of diaconia and charisma can we stop telling congregations what is good for them, but start communicating with them about their own liberation and on their own terms. So after walking and talking, we find ourselves at the Bridge of Sighs. And I stop and ask if Scott will return with me to Washington, D.C. and then to Howard University School of Divinity to preach where I was scheduled to preach at Rankin Chapel. I'm so glad he agrees, because he has some things right and many things to learn about this. It's a blessed meeting of that, I'm sure. And I want to see what will become of it. In authenticity and worship and prayer, we will keep celebrating the sacred until we embody it. In life-centered diversity of community, we will keep practicing love until we get it right. As a critical yet hopeful prophetic minority, we will keep calling for justice until it prevails. In the midst of the groaning of creation, we will keep longing for kingdom until kingdom comes. Rest in peace, Dr. Johns. See you on the other side. If Vernon Johns were here today, I think he would be looking back at the preaching in the black church and he would say, lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing raise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed? We have come over a way with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last where the white gleam of our star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou hast brought us thus far on the way. Thou who hast taught by Thy might, let us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met Thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget Thee. Shadowed beneath Thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land.